They said wild horses never sought out humans. But on a windswept morning in New Mexico, a cowboy turned in his saddle to find a half-starved foal barely 2 months old, stumbling after him, refusing to be left behind. What followed wasn't just a rescue. It was a test of law and loyalty, of grief and compassion, and a reunion so powerful it brought a hardened rancher to tears. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The first light of autumn spilled across the canyon country, painting the cliffs in deep rust and golden amber. From the eastern rim, the sun rose slowly, pushing back the shadows that clung to the rock walls. Below, the desert stretched in every direction, a vast mosaic of sagebrush, twisted juniper, and clusters of cactus bristling against the hard ground. The air carried the dry bite of sand and stone. Every breath was sharp, tinged with dust. High overhead, a pair of vultures wheeled in wide circles, their black wings catching the light. The land was harsh, unyielding, but there was a beauty here that demanded reverence, a beauty born of silence, of endurance, of the way time itself seemed to move more slowly beneath the endless sky. Tucked within this vast expanse lay Red Mesa Ranch, 14,000 acres of red earth and open range that had belonged to the Walker family for 3 generations. Weathered wooden fences zigzagged across the valley, holding scattered clusters of cattle that grazed lazily on patches of tough grass. A few barns and outbuildings stood along the main drive, but solid, each scarred beam and nailhead carrying stories of storms endured and winters survived. The ranch was more than land and cattle. It was heritage stitched into the very soil, a reminder of the men and women who had poured sweat and years into carving a life here. Seasons dictated everything. In the wet months, the arroyos flooded, carving new paths through the clay. In the dry months, the earth cracked and animals wandered miles in search of water. Life here was a constant negotiation with nature, never a victory, always a balance. Ethan Walker had been born into that balance. At 50, he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than most men spent behind a desk. His frame was lean but strong, hardened by decades of ranch work. His face bore the weather's imprint, fine lines etched around his eyes. The skin darkened by sun and wind, a permanent squint, as if he were always looking across a bright horizon. People in the county knew him as steady, dependable, the sort of man who kept his word even when it cost him. Beneath the outward calm, though, there was a weight, a quiet sorrow that lingered in the way. He sometimes paused mid-sentence or stared too long at the horizon when conversation drifted toward the past. He was a man of routine, and routine kept him grounded. Each week he saddled his horse Dusty and rode the outer boundaries of the ranch. Dusty was an 11-year-old quarter horse with a broad chest, steady stride, and a temperament that mirrored his rider's patient, unshaken loyal. Together, they covered the same trails again and again, checking fence lines, counting head of cattle, watching the level of the stock ponds. These rides were part necessity, part ritual. Ethan always carried a small leather journal in his shirt pocket, its cover scuffed and softened with age. It had belonged to his father before him, and his grandfather before that. Inside were notes about the land and the cattle, the weather, every observation that mattered in the rhythm of ranch life. Writing in it wasn't just record-keeping. For Ethan, it was a way of listening to the land, of staying in step with those who had come before. But no routine could fully shield him from the ache of absence. 3 years earlier, his wife Claire had died suddenly of a heart attack. One moment she was laughing at something he said in the kitchen. The next, she was gone. The shock had shattered him in ways the hardest droughts and the fiercest winters never could. Claire had been more than his partner. She had been his anchor, the one person who could read his moods before he spoke, who carried enough gentleness, to soften his sharp edges. Without her, the ranch felt emptier, the nights longer, the silence heavier. He managed the work, he managed the cattle, but he struggled to manage the loneliness. Often during his weekly rides, Ethan would stop on a ridge and open the journal. He'd write about the wind direction, the condition of the grass, the movement of the herd. And yet, in the spaces between those practical notes, he found himself writing for Claire, as if each word might carry across the distance between them. Sometimes, he wrote about the way Dusty lifted his ears at a sound. Sometimes he wrote about the sky or the way the canyon walls caught fire with evening light. The act of writing made him feel less alone, as if Claire still walked beside him, her hand brushing his arm, her voice urging him to notice the small wonders of the world. Claire had always been that way, gentle, compassionate, attuned to every living creature. She had a knack for rescuing strays, for pausing in the middle of a busy day to cradle a wounded bird or coax a feral kitten from under the porch. Ethan used to tease her, "You'd take in the whole desert if you could." She would only smile and reply, "Every soul deserves a chance." It was more than a phrase. It was her conviction, the lens through which she viewed every life, human or animal. Ethan hadn't thought much of those words while she lived. He admired them, respected them. But only after her passing did they settle deep into him like seeds waiting for rain. Now, when he rode the boundary of the ranch and paused to listen to the wind, he heard her voice. When he watched a calf stumble to its feet for the first time or saw a hawk circle endlessly above the canyon, he remembered her eyes, the way they lit up at moments of fragile beauty. That simple truth, every soul deserves a chance, had become his compass, though he didn't yet realize how soon it would be tested. Ethan sat tall in the saddle as Dusty picked his way along the ridge trail, the journal pressing against his chest pocket. The desert spread out before him, ancient and unchanging. But within that expanse, something unexpected was waiting. Somewhere out there among the rocks and sagebrush, a life clung precariously to survival. A life that would soon cross his path and challenge everything he thought he knew about rules, mercy, and the fragile line between man and the wild. The ridge trail narrowed as Ethan and Dusty moved along the jagged edge of sandstone. Hooves rang against the hard-packed ground, each strike echoing against the canyon walls. The wind had picked up since morning, whipping across the mesa with a dry hiss carrying sand that stung the skin and left a bitter taste of dust in the mouth. Ethan hunched a little lower in the saddle, tugging his hat down against the gusts. His eyes seasoned by years of scanning fence lines and reading the land swept over the posts and wire that stretched unevenly along the cliff's shoulder. Everything looked intact. Dusty's stride remained steady, his ears flicking toward the wind, then back again. Ethan opened his shirt pocket and withdrew the leather journal, balancing it on his thigh. He jotted a few quick notes in his blunt, practical handwriting, fence line intact. No sign of strays, water levels low on south pasture. Then he paused, listening. The canyon lay in silence, broken only by the moan of wind and the distant rasping call of a raven circling overhead. Out here, silence was as natural as breath until something broke it. Behind him came a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was just a shuffle, a faint, irregular rhythm carried on the wind. Ethan tightened the reins, and Dusty slowed to a halt, ears snapping back. Ethan twisted in the saddle. What he saw made him blink in disbelief. From the bend in the trail staggered a foal, small and ragged, barely 2 months old. Its coat was dull matted with dust and sweat hanging loose on a frame far too thin. Each step was a struggle. Its legs trembled under its own weight, yet still it pressed forward, stumbling after Dusty like a shadow, desperate not to be left behind. The sight rooted Ethan in the saddle. Wild foals avoided men like fire, but this scrap of life was dragging itself toward him as if its only hope was bound to his horse's trail. Each time Dusty moved forward, the foal lurched to keep up. When Ethan halted, it stopped, too panting, swaying on its spindly legs, eyes fixed on him with a strange, haunting determination. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had lived his life among cattle and horses, had seen sickness and loss countless times. But there was something unnatural about this. A foal alone without its dam was a death sentence in the wild. And yet, here it was, closing the distance with stubborn persistence, as if begging him not to turn away. Dusty snorted, tossing his head. The foal flinched at the sound, but did not retreat. Ethan guided Dusty a few paces farther up the trail, and sure enough, the foal stumbled forward again, hooves dragging sides, heaving with effort. It was as if the little creature had chosen him, Ethan Walker, out of the whole desolate canyon, to be its salvation. The closer it came, the worse its condition revealed itself to be. Ethan reined Dusty in and studied the foal with the steady gaze of a man accustomed to reading life and death in animals. The colt barely reached his hip ribs, jutting stark beneath the loose hide belly hollowed by hunger. Its eyes were sunken, clouded with the dullness of dehydration. Yet somewhere within them flickered the faintest spark of will. Every few steps, its knees buckled, threatening to spill it into the dirt. Then Ethan saw the mark that made his gut twist. Around the foal's neck, just visible beneath the scraggly fur, ran a thin scar, clean, sharp, unmistakable. A rope scar. This was no wild accident, no misfortune of nature. At some point, someone had caught this animal, bound it, and left behind a wound that told of human interference. Dusty pinned his ears, nostrils flaring at the faint iron tang of old blood in the air. Ethan pulled him to a stop. Slowly, deliberately, he swung down from the saddle. His boots crunched on gravel as he let the reins fall slack, his movements careful, measured. The foal kept coming. Each step was hesitant, trembling, but it did not turn away. Its eyes locked on him, as though tethered by invisible string. Ethan crouched slightly, palms open, keeping his voice low and calm. "Easy, boy," he murmured. "I'm not going to hurt you." For a long moment, the foal stood swaying sides, quivering nostrils flaring with shallow, desperate breaths. Then it gave a sound so frail, so unlike anything Ethan had expected, that it pierced him straight through. A high, cracked whinny, rasping and thin like the cry of a child lost in the dark. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't warning. It was a plea. The sound clawed open something inside Ethan he thought he'd long buried. In an instant, he was back on a dusty roadside with Claire at his side, watching her kneel to cradle a shivering stray dog that had wandered into traffic. He remembered how she had lifted its head, speaking softly, as though the animal understood every word, and how he had laughed at her tenderness before realizing it was no laughing matter at all. That was Claire seeing value where others saw none, hearing cries for help others ignored. Now standing on the ridge with the desert wind tearing at his coat, Ethan heard her voice as clearly as if she were beside him. Every soul deserves a chance. He closed his eyes briefly, fighting the ache in his chest. If Claire were here, there would be no hesitation. She would already have her arms around the foal, already be soothing it, already be rewriting its fate. And suddenly, Ethan knew with absolute certainty what she would ask of him now. His mind warred with itself. He knew the law. Wild foals without their mothers rarely survived, and the Bureau of Land Management had strict rules. Keeping one was a violation, an act that could cost him fines, worse if they deemed it harboring. The right thing, the legal thing, was to call it in, let the system handle it. But looking at the pitiful creature before him, he knew what that would mean. Protocols? paperwork, euthanasia. He glanced down at the foal. Its legs trembled, threatening collapse. Its breathing was ragged, but its gaze never wavered. Desperation burned there, raw and undeniable. If he rode away now, he would be signing the animal's death. The silence stretched, filled only by the foal's labored panting and the steady beat of Ethan's heart. He stood still, hands loose at his sides, staring into those pleading eyes. He had seen enough suffering in his life to recognize the moment when a soul teetered on the edge. And he wouldn't be the one to push it over. At last, he exhaled long and steady, the decision crystallizing inside him. "Easy now, little one," he said softly. "You're safe." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small piece of dried apple, one he had been saving for Dusty. He held it between his fingers, extending his hand slowly. The foal's nostrils flared at the scent ears, twitching uncertainly. Step by shaky step, it moved closer. Its hooves scraped on the stones, its head lowered. Ethan knelt in the dust, stretching his hand forward, palm open. "Come on," he coaxed gently. "Take it if you want it." The foal hesitated only a heartbeat longer. Then its soft lips brushed his palm, snatching the bit of apple. It chewed weakly, then licked at the salt of his skin, as though searching for more. Ethan felt the roughness of its tongue and the tremor in its jaw, and something inside him gave way. That was it. The choice was made. Ethan rested his other hand lightly against the foal's neck, careful of the scar. Its skin was hot beneath his touch, the pulse rapid, frantic. But the animal did not pull away. Instead, it leaned into him, the weight of trust, unexpected and undeniable. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I can't leave you here," he murmured almost to himself. "Not today." The wind gusted hard across the ridge, rattling the sage and scattering loose sand over his boots. Above, the vultures tilted in the air, but Ethan no longer noticed them. His focus was on the fragile creature before him, the foal who had chosen him, who had stumbled out of the wild not to run, but to follow. And in that moment, Ethan understood his life, so carefully ordered by routine and memory, had just shifted. The trail he rode each week had taken a turn, leading him toward something he had never expected. Toward responsibility, toward danger, toward the ache of hope, and maybe, just maybe, toward redemption. Ethan drew in a slow breath of the dust and sun, heavy in his lungs. He crouched on the ridge, pulling a folded tarp from the saddlebag slung over Dusty's flank. The canvas was stiff from disuse edges, frayed by years of service. He shook it out and spread it flat across the red earth, anchoring the corners with stones so the wind wouldn't carry it away. The foal, barely steady on its legs, watched him with wide eyes, ears flicking at every rasp of fabric. "Easy now," Ethan murmured, keeping his tone low and steady the way he would with a nervous calf. He reached into his pocket again, retrieving another piece of dried apple. Holding it in his palm, he coaxed the foal closer. Hunger proved stronger than fear. With hesitant steps, it stumbled forward, nostrils twitching, then snatched the treat and lingered, expectant. "That's it," Ethan said. "One more step." He placed another sliver of fruit in the middle of the tarp. The foal hesitated legs, trembling beneath its thin body. Its sides heaved, ribs stark against its hide. After a long moment, it took the bait, stepping onto the canvas. Its hooves scraped against the coarse fabric, ears flicking nervously. Ethan knelt close, whispering encouragement, until at last, exhaustion overcame hesitation. The little creature folded its legs beneath itself and sank onto the tarp, too weary to resist. "There you go," Ethan breathed. He worked the edges of the tarp carefully around its body, creating a cocoon, snug enough to hold, but loose enough not to frighten. The foal gave a weak snort, but did not struggle. Dusty stood nearby, ears twitching, muscles tight, as if sensing the weight of the moment. His dark eyes followed every move, head raised, tail swishing against the flies, as though he knew they were about to take on more than they bargained for. "Easy, little one." "I got you," Ethan whispered, tying the last knot. He touched the foal's muzzle, feeling the hot, rapid breath against his calloused hand. The animal's eyes fluttered, half closed. It trusted him, or maybe it was simply too tired not to. The journey home began slowly. Ethan rigged the tarp to Dusty's saddle, fashioning a makeshift sling that cradled the foal against the gelding's broad back. Dusty flicked an ear when Ethan tightened the knots, then stood steady as if he understood this burden was not optional. Ethan kept one hand on the bundle and the other on the reins as he led them down the rocky incline. The trail that usually took an hour felt endless. Each hoofbeat rang like a hammer in Ethan's chest, each jolt of the saddle making him glance back to be sure the foal hadn't slipped. The canvas swayed gently with Dusty's movement, the little body inside rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. At one point, Ethan swore the colt had gone limp, and his heart lurched until he saw the faint twitch of its ears. "Hang on," he muttered. "We'll get you home." The desert stretched around them in silence. The usual comfort Ethan found in the solitude of the land had given way to a tension that gnawed at his gut. He'd carried calves on horseback before, driven sick yearlings to shelter in storms. But this was different. The fragility of the life bundled behind him weighed heavier than the physical load. He could feel it with every step, fear and resolve braided together, one daring him to turn back the other, pushing him forward. By the time the ranch came into view, the sun had dipped low, setting the sky ablaze with streaks of crimson and gold. Shadows stretched long across the fence lines, and the barns glowed with the last light of day. Dusty plodded into the yard sides, lathered from the careful, deliberate pace. Near the tool shed stood Miguel Alvarez, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hammer in hand. He looked up at the unexpected sound of hooves. "You're back early," Miguel called, brow furrowing. He set the hammer aside and wiped his hands on his jeans, squinting toward the horse. Ethan slowed Dusty to a halt, his mouth dry. Miguel's gaze shifted to the bulky tarp strapped to the saddle. He stepped closer, suspicion sharp in his eyes. "What the hell are you bringing back?" Ethan swung down silently, fingers working the knots. The tarp sagged open, revealing the foal curled within its bony frame, trembling eyes barely open. Miguel froze. His dark eyes widened, the color draining from his face. "Madre de Dios?" "That's a wild foal." He dropped into a crouch beside the bundle, scanning the little body, taking in the protruding ribs, the dull coat, the rope scar around its neck. Compassion flashed across his features, but it warred with something harder, more cautious. He straightened hands on his hips, shaking his head. "You know the feds won't like this, hermano," he said grimly. "BLM finds out, they'll be all over you." Ethan lifted the foal gently from the tarp, cradling it against his chest, the way a man might hold a child. The animal's head lolled against his shoulder, breath rattling softly in his ear. Ethan's voice came low and steady. "I couldn't leave him to die," he said. His eyes met Miguel's, hard and unflinching. "Claire wouldn't forgive me." The name hung in the air like a bell tolling through silence. Both men fell still. For Miguel, Claire had been like a sister, gentle, stubborn, a woman whose compassion reached beyond sense or caution. He saw her face in Ethan's words, heard her laughter in memory, and knew there was no use arguing with the ghost she had left behind. Miguel exhaled heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "Damn it," he muttered. "You always did let her heart lead yours." He looked at the foal again, then at Ethan. "Fine. But this stays between us. Only us?" Ethan nodded once. "Only us." They both knew the stakes. If word reached town, rumors would spread faster than wildfire. And when the Bureau of Land Management got wind, there'd be no saving the colt. Keeping it secret wasn't just about shielding Ethan from trouble. It was the only chance the little animal had. Miguel jerked his head toward the old storage shed behind the main barn. "Come on. Let's give the little one a place to breathe." The shed had stood unused for years, cluttered with rusting tools, broken harnesses, and stacks of lumber warped by time. Dust hung in the air, stirred by their boots. Miguel began clearing space with the efficiency of a man used to making do, tossing aside cracked buckets and tangled ropes. He spread an armful of dry straw across the concrete floor, of the golden stalks catching the fading light. Ethan set the foal down, carefully guiding its legs beneath it, until it lay nestled in the straw. Miguel fetched a small trough from the barn and filled it with water. Ethan dug into his saddlebag again, pulling out the last of the apple and a handful of crushed oats. He set them near the foal, though he knew it would take time before the animal regained the strength to eat. The makeshift stall was no palace, but it was warm, sheltered, and safe, more than the foal had likely known in weeks. The little creature shifted, sighing, as if surrendering to the comfort of straw beneath its body. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching as the foal's breathing slowed, eyes fluttering toward sleep. Miguel stood beside him, his expression carved by equal parts concern and reluctant acceptance. "This is trouble, amigo," Miguel said quietly. Ethan's reply came without hesitation, his voice steady, resolute. "Maybe. But sometimes trouble's worth it." Silence settled over the shed, broken only by the soft rustle of the foal stirring in its bed. Outside, the sky darkened, and the first stars pricked through the veil of dusk. Within those walls, a fragile secret had been born, one that would test their loyalty, their courage, and their will to stand against the rules of men in order to honor the quiet plea of a life too young to be lost. The following morning dawned pale and brittle, the kind of desert light that seemed to bleach the world before color returned. Ethan drove his battered pickup into the small town, 20 miles away, the engine grumbling like an old dog. He parked outside Peterson's Feed and Supply, a place he had visited countless times for salt blocks, barbed wire, and saddle soap, but never with a shopping list like today's. Inside, the air smelled of grain and alfalfa. Rows of shelves held everything from bolts and nails to bags of feed stacked higher than his head. Ethan moved deliberately, filling a cart with items that made little sense when taken together. Bags of milk replacer meant for orphaned livestock, a box of rubber bottle feeders, bundles of straw, a galvanized bucket, heat lamps, rolls of gauze antiseptic spray. He loaded them with the quiet intensity of a man on a mission. Behind the counter, Mary Peterson watched him with one brow arched. She had run the store for 3 decades, and few things in ranch country surprised her anymore. But the combination Ethan carried to the register made her pause. Bottle feeders, heat lamps. She tilted her head, eyeing him. "You raising calves now?" Ethan met her gaze steadily, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint smile. "Something like that." Mary studied him for a beat longer. She had known Ethan all her life, knew he spoke only as much as needed. She didn't press. With a shrug, she rang up the items, sliding them across the worn counter. When Ethan returned to the ranch, the pickup bed was piled high, tools of survival rattling with each bump of the dirt road. Dust rose in a golden plume behind him, the sun glinting off the metal bucket and the silver curve of the heat lamps. It felt like a declaration, an unspoken promise, that he wasn't about to let the fragile life in his care fade without a fight. Back at the ranch, Miguel had wasted no time. The old storage shed behind the main barn, once nothing but a graveyard of rusting plows and cobwebbed tack, was transformed by effort and sweat. Miguel had dragged the broken machinery into the yard, sweeping out years of dust with a stiff broom. He spread a thick layer of straw across the concrete floor, the golden bedding muffling sound and offering warmth. In one corner, he set a metal trough for water. In another, a basket ready for fresh hay. Overhead, a heat lamp now hung from a rafter, casting a warm amber glow that softened the shadows. By the time Ethan drove in, the foal lay on the straw curled like a fragile secret. Its eyes fluttered open at the sound of boots on gravel ears pricking toward the familiar voices. Miguel leaned on the doorframe, a crooked grin on his face. "This is turning into a nursery, hermano." Ethan dropped a sack of straw from his shoulder. "Only until he's strong enough," he said. "Then we'll see." The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of vigilance. In the first 3 days, the foal, still too weak to rise for long, survived on diluted milk replacer that Ethan fed through a rubber bottle every few hours. The work was relentless. Nights were broken into shifts, Ethan sitting with the foal until dawn, Miguel taking over before heading out to tend the cattle. Every breath the foal drew seemed a small victory. Sometimes in the quiet hours, Ethan would lean close just to hear the fragile wheeze of its lungs, reassuring himself that it was still alive. The animal trembled each time it stood, legs quaking like saplings in the wind. But the straw bedding and steady warmth of the lamp kept it from slipping away. By the third night, the dull glaze in its eyes began to recede, replaced by a faint spark of curiosity. It would lift its head when Ethan entered, ears swiveling at the sound of boots, nostrils twitching toward the smell of oats and hay. Ethan recorded everything in his father's leather journal. The approximate weight, the ounces of milk consumed, the strength of its steps. Each detail marked progress, proof that the battle for survival wasn't lost. By the second week, the changes were undeniable. The foal's legs grew steadier, its small hooves striking straw with tentative confidence. The rasping whinny softened, becoming clearer, higher, as if it had found its voice again. It paced the stall, nosing at the water trough, nibbling playfully at the straw. Sometimes it would toss its head and give a short, sharp snort that made Miguel laugh. One morning, as Ethan stepped inside with the bottle, the foal nickered softly, a sound so warm and direct it made his chest tighten. He crouched, offering the milk, and shook his head with a quiet chuckle. "You're tougher than you look, little one." Miguel, leaning on the rail, crossed his arms. "He's got spirit. I didn't think he'd last a week, but..." He shrugged. "Maybe he's got a chance." His voice carried hope, though his eyes remained wary, the shadow of the Bureau of Land Management never far from mind. Still, neither man could deny what was happening in that shed. The foal was not just recovering, it was thriving. And with every ounce of strength it regained, so too did Ethan's conviction that saving it had been the only choice. One late afternoon, Ethan sat on a bale of straw, watching the foal trot clumsily in circles. Dust motes swirled in the golden light, and the sound of hooves on straw echoed in the close air. "Guess you're one lucky soul," Ethan murmured almost to himself, "surviving out there all alone." Miguel, stacking hay nearby, looked up and grinned. "So that's his name, then?" Lucky Ethan smiled faintly, nodding. "Yeah. Lucky, the survivor." From then on, the name stuck. Each time Ethan stepped into the stall and called softly Lucky, the foal's ears flicked up and it trotted toward him, eyes bright with recognition. The sound became a tether, binding them closer each day. Weeks passed and the bond deepened. Lucky followed Ethan like a shadow tail, flicking hooves clicking on the wooden floor. When Ethan crouched, the foal pressed its head into his chest, eyes closing the gesture achingly childlike. Ethan would sit for hours back against the stall wall journal balanced on his knee while Lucky dozed beside him. Sometimes he wrote notes about feed and weight, other times nothing at all, content to let silence fill the space. Miguel teased him once, watching as Lucky nuzzled Ethan's hand. "Careful, amigo. He's winning your heart." Ethan gave a rare laugh, low and dry. Maybe he already did. But beneath the humor lay something truer, something neither man spoke aloud. For Ethan, Lucky wasn't just a foal anymore. At night, when Ethan held the bottle to Lucky's mouth, watching the eager gulps, memories came unbidden. He saw Claire kneeling in the dirt years ago, coaxing a half-starved dog with scraps from her pocket. He remembered her voice gentle, firm, filled with certainty as she whispered, "Every soul deserves a chance." Now, with Lucky's warm breath damp against his hands, Ethan felt her presence as if she sat beside him, urging him forward. The foal had become a bridge between past and present, binding Ethan once more to the tenderness he thought had died with his wife. The ranch at night was quiet, except for the soft rustle of straw and the steady rhythm of Lucky's breathing. Sometimes Ethan closed his eyes and listened, letting the sound wash away years of grief. Piece by piece, the emptiness left by Claire's absence filled with something new, fragile, but real. By the third week, Lucky was nearly unrecognizable from the skeletal creature Ethan had first carried home. His coat gleamed in the lamplight, his legs held steady beneath him, and his eyes shone bright with mischief. He bucked clumsily in the straw, tossed his head, and let out whinnies so loud they startled the barn cats. One evening, Ethan leaned on the fence arms, folded, watching Lucky chase his own tail across the small paddock they had opened to give him space. The setting sun painted the ranch in fire, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to peace. The grief that had wrapped itself around him since Claire's death loosened, if only for a moment. Miguel joined him, arms braced on the top rail. "Looks like you found yourself some hope, hermano," he said quietly. Ethan's gaze never left the foal bounding across the grass. "Maybe I have." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain from the far horizon. Clouds gathered at the edges of the desert sky, dark and heavy. Ethan squinted toward them, his heart steady but wary, for now, within the fence line, there was peace. But beyond it, storms brewed storms that neither he nor Lucky would be able to outrun forever. It started with innocence, yet the kind that never meant harm. One warm afternoon, Miguel's teenage daughter brought a friend from town to the ranch. The two girls wandered between the corrals, laughter carrying in the dry air. They passed the old shed, and through the open slats of the door, the foal lifted his head. "Look at the baby horse," Miguel's daughter exclaimed, pointing. "Isn't he cute?" The other girl gasped, eyes wide, pressing her face against the wooden rail. The foal wobbled to his feet, ears pricking toward the unfamiliar voices. "He's adorable. I didn't know you had one." Neither girl thought much of it. But children carry stories the way rivers carry water, fast, unstoppable. By the time school began again, whispers had turned into chatter. Ethan Walker's raising a wild foal. Within days, the tales spread through town, polished and exaggerated with each retelling. By the time it reached the coffee shop on Main Street, it sounded less like gossip and more like certainty. Miguel heard it first, a murmur carried back from a neighbor who'd overheard. He told Ethan quietly, thoughts drawn with worry. By then, it was too late. The secret had slipped from their hands like sand through open fingers. The local paper called 2 mornings later. Ethan answered the landline in the ranch kitchen, the receiver heavy against his ear. A woman's voice, bright curious, asked outright about the story of you rescuing a wild foal. Ethan's jaw clenched. No comment, he said, and hung up. His silence did nothing to smother the fire. Instead, it fanned the flames. By that evening, the story was all over town. In the diner, some praised Ethan's compassion. Others shook their heads, muttering about reckless behavior, about laws being broken. At the feed store, an old rancher said, "Man's got a soft heart. That colt's lucky." Another countered, "Soft heart or not, he's asking for trouble. You don't mess with BLM and come out clean." Miguel cornered Ethan outside the barn, his voice low and tense. "This is getting out of hand, hermano. People talk, and sooner or later the wrong ears will hear." He was right. Within a week, the rumors had reached the county sheriff's office. It was late in the afternoon when Ethan heard the rumble of tires on gravel. He looked up from mending a gate to see a dusty Ford pickup roll into the yard. The door opened, and Sheriff Sam Carter stepped out. He carried himself with the weight of authority, though his shoulders sloped with something soft or regret, maybe. Sam removed his hat, brushing dust from the brim. "Ethan," he said quietly, "we need to talk." They sat on the porch steps, as the air heavy between them. Sam balanced his hat on his knee, his jaw tight. "I get it, Ethan," he began. "I really do. But the law ain't written for exceptions, and this time, you're making one." Ethan stared past him toward the distant ridgeline where he'd first found the foal. His voice, when it came, was rough-worn. "Would you have walked away if it were a child?" The question landed like a stone in water. Sam blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, his face showed both frustration and sympathy. He shifted, cleared his throat. "The law doesn't see it that way. Wild foals don't get treated like children. Hell, most of them don't get treated like anything more than a statistic." Ethan's fists curled against his thighs. "So what happens if they take him?" Sam exhaled, his eyes somber. "You know the protocol. They'll bring him to a holding facility, run their evaluations." His voice dropped lower. "Odds are, he won't make it. Most orphans don't. Without a dam, they don't waste resources." The words cut deeper than Sam intended. Ethan's eyes flashed, his voice sharp. "So they'd rather kill him than let someone care for him?" "I'm not saying it's right," Sam answered firmly. "I'm saying it's the system we've got." The two men sat in silence, and the wind rattling the porch boards. Ethan rose slowly, stepping onto the gravel, gaze locked on the shed where Lucky played in the straw. The foal's high-pitched whinny carried faintly across the yard, bright and alive. Ethan felt anger coil in his chest, a helpless fury at a world where survival could be written off by paperwork. Sam followed his gaze. "Ethan, you can't win against the law. Not this way." But Ethan heard something else. Claire's voice, gentle and unyielding. "Every soul deserves a chance." The words echoed in his skull, louder than Sam's warnings. When he spoke again, his voice trembled with restrained conviction. "I found him dying, Sam. You tell me, what was I supposed to do? Just ride away?" Sam's expression tightened. "You were supposed to call BLM. Let them handle it." "Handle it," Ethan snapped. "You mean put him down? That's not handling. That's ending." Sam's shoulders sagged. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes weary. "I've seen it before. Too many times. It's cruel, I know. But if everyone kept wild foals, there'd be chaos. No law, no order, just good intentions running wild." Ethan stepped closer, eyes fierce. "Sometimes doing the right thing means breaking a rule written by someone who's never looked into eyes like his." The sheriff studied him for a long beat. Then his voice softened. You've grown attached, Ethan. That makes this harder. Ethan didn't blink. He's alive because I broke the rule. And I'd do it again. The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. At last, Sam rose, setting his hat back on his head. He adjusted the brim, gaze heavy. I won't file a report yet, he said finally. But Ethan, time's running out. Sooner or later, BLM will come knocking. Ethan stood still as the sheriff descended the porch steps, boots crunching on gravel. The pickup's engine roared to life, carrying him away down the dirt road. Dust billowed behind until the truck was gone, leaving only silence in its wake. That night, Ethan stood in the shed, leaning against the rail. Lucky lay in the straw legs, folded neatly beneath him, breathing deep and even. The foal stirred when Ethan stepped closer, lifting his head eyes bright in the lamplight. With a soft nicker, he nudged against Ethan's chest. Ethan sank onto the straw beside him, running a hand along the smooth curve of his neck. His voice dropped to a whisper, raw with promise. I won't let them take you. Not without a fight. Behind him, the door creaked open. Miguel entered quietly, laying a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. Careful, hermano, he murmured. You're walking a thin line. Ethan didn't answer. He only sat in the hush of the shed, heart pounding with the weight of choices yet to come. Love once simple had become defiance. And with each breath Lucky took, Ethan knew the battle was no longer about law or order. It was about survival, about keeping a promise made to the living, and to the memory of the woman whose words still guided him. The morning after Sheriff Carter's visit broke with a sharp chill, the kind of air that carried both clarity and foreboding. Miguel found Ethan by the corral arms, folded across his chest, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if searching for answers in the line where earth met sky. You can't keep this up forever, Miguel said gently. His tone carried no judgment, only weary honesty. Ethan didn't look at him. I know. Miguel hesitated, then pressed on. Call Hannah. She's helped us before. Maybe she'll know what to do now. For a long moment, Ethan remained still, boots planted in the dust. The thought of asking for outside help felt like opening the gate to everything he feared: the law, the end of Lucky's fragile sanctuary here. But he knew Miguel was right. Keeping the foal at Red Mesa Ranch indefinitely wasn't possible. The walls of rumor and regulation were closing in. By mid-morning, Ethan had dialed the number. Dr. Hannah Brooks picked up on the second ring. Hannah, it's Ethan Walker. I figured you'd be calling. She replied, her voice even but touched with warmth. Word gets around fast in this county. You've got yourself quite a situation. Ethan grimaced. So you've heard. I've heard enough. Keeping him there is a risk, Ethan. You know that. But... Her pause stretched long enough to make Ethan's chest tighten. There's a sanctuary up in Colorado. They specialize in wild foals. If he's strong enough, they might take him. Her words landed like a blade, slicing through the tether Ethan had tied to the young horse. He could almost feel the cut raw and bleeding inside. He said nothing at first, only breathed. Think about it, Hannah urged softly. Better he has a chance there than none at all. When the call ended, Ethan stood in the kitchen with the receiver still pressed to his ear, the silence heavy as stone. That night, he walked the fence line in the dark. Stars blazed above the desert, cold and distant. From the shed came the sound of a soft nicker. Lucky spotted him in the shadows and trotted to the door, pressing his small head through the slats, eyes bright, even in the dim light. Ethan laid a hand on the foal's forehead. What am I going to do with you, little one? His voice cracked. The foal pushed harder against the bars, as if trying to close the space between them. Inside pride and dread warred. He had brought the colt back from the edge of death, had given it warmth, food, safety. Every breath Lucky drew now was a testament to his stubborn defiance of rules. But the echo of Sam Carter's warning clanged in his head, time's running out. A few days later, Hannah called back with news. I reached someone. Dr. Rachel Morgan. She's one of the best, 15 years working with wild horses, published studies, field experience. She's willing to come see him. Ethan's throat tightened. When soon Hannah said, she's already on her way. Rachel Morgan arrived at dawn 3 days later. Her truck rolled into the yard, dust rising in the early light. She stepped out wearing jeans boots and a weathered jacket, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. Her movements were brisk, confident, her eyes the sharp, assessing kind of someone used to reading both animals and people. Ethan greeted her with a guarded nod. Miguel hung back, arms crossed. Together, they led Rachel to the shed. The foal lifted his head as they entered, ears pricking, nostrils flaring at the scent of a stranger. Rachel stopped just inside the door, watching for a moment. A flicker of surprise softened her professional composure. He looks remarkably well for a foal in his condition, she murmured. Ethan's heart gave a strange lurch at the words. Rachel set down her bag and knelt, pulling out tools, a stethoscope, a measuring tape, a digital scale designed for livestock. Lucky shifted uneasily, stepping back, but Ethan moved closer, resting a hand on his neck. The foal's stilled eyes darting but body calm, as if Ethan's presence was enough to anchor him. Rachel worked methodically. She pressed the stethoscope against Lucky's chest, listening to the rapid drum of his heart. She checked his lungs, his teeth, the growth of his hooves. She ran her hands down his legs, testing joints for strength. Each observation went into a notebook with neat, precise handwriting. Miguel watched from the corner, his brow furrowed, arms locked tight across his chest. Ethan stood silent, every muscle taut, as though Rachel's verdict would seal more than the foal's fate. Respiration normal. Weights lower than average, but improving, Rachel narrated as she wrote. She lifted her camera, snapping photos of Lucky standing, Lucky moving, Lucky sniffing at Ethan's sleeve. She recorded a short video of him pacing the stall. We'll need this for the sanctuary board. Through it all, Lucky tolerated her touch only because Ethan stood close. Each time she leaned in, he would flick an ear toward Ethan, glance at him, then relax again. After more than an hour, Rachel closed her notebook. She rose, brushing straw from her knees. He's healthy, she said, her tone clear and final. Alert, resilient. You've done a remarkable job. The words struck Ethan in the gut. Pride swelled first, validation that the sleepless nights, the endless bottle feedings, the risk of defiance had all mattered. But pride was chased immediately by dread. Because if Lucky was healthy, if Lucky was ready, then he was also ready to leave. Rachel continued, unaware of the storm in Ethan's chest. He still keeps his wild instincts. That's good. It means he hasn't lost what he'll need to survive in a herd. Some foals imprint too heavily on humans at this age. That's not the case here. He'll integrate. Miguel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So he has a shot. Rachel nodded. More than a shot. He has a future. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat burning. He couldn't bring himself to answer. Later, when Rachel stepped outside to make a call, Ethan sank onto the wooden step outside the shed. Lucky bounded toward him, playful now, tossing a piece of straw between his teeth as if it were a game. Ethan reached out, running a hand down the foal's neck. The touch filled him with both joy and grief. He survived because I broke the rule, Ethan thought bitterly. But now the same rule might take him away. Rachel returned, her expression softer this time. She crouched nearby, her voice quieter than before. Ethan, letting go doesn't erase what you've done. You gave him a chance to live. That's something no law can take away from you. Ethan looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, resting against Lucky's warm hide. He said nothing. By late afternoon, Rachel packed her bag, tucking the notebook and camera inside. I'll send this to the sanctuary board. They'll be in touch within days to arrange transport. Miguel glanced at Ethan, reading the hollowness in his friend's eyes. Ethan forced a nod, though it felt heavy as stone. He bent to stroke Lucky's mane, whispering under his breath, "We'll figure this out, boy. One way or another." The foal pressed against him, unconcerned with human rules, content in the moment. Sunset bled across the Red Mesa ranch, the light gold and melancholy. It painted the shed, the fences, the distant ridges, in a wash of fading fire. Ethan stood there, caught between pride and sorrow, watching shadows stretch long across the yard. The door to parting had cracked open. And though Ethan wasn't ready, he knew the hinge was already turning. Miguel's boots hammered the porch like warning shots. He burst through the doorway to the barn aisle, breathless eyes bright and urgent. "Ethan, there's a mare by the north fence. You need to see this." The words jolted through Ethan like a current. He swung around from the feed room as Dr. Rachel Morgan, startled, straightened from her clipboard. Dust motes spun in the morning light that slanted through the open doors, the air already warming with the promise of a hard, bright day. "Show me," Ethan said. They crossed the yard at a brisk clip, Miguel a few strides ahead, Rachel keeping pace with that efficient, economical stride of hers. They skirted the equipment shed and followed the fence line north until the land fell away into a swale of sage and brittle grass. There, just beyond the wire, stood a bay mare. She was the color of warm earth after rain, though travel had thinned her to sinew and bone. Sweat etched dark rivulets along her ribs. A fresh scrape marred her shoulder. But her eyes, God, her eyes burned with a fierce, hard light Ethan felt rather than saw. The mare threw up her head and screamed a high-carrying call that split the morning and rolled like thunder down the shallow valley. It was not the wild, flinging challenge of a Mustang facing a stallion. It was a summons, piercing, insistent, aimed straight at the barn behind them. Ethan's jaw set. The hairs at the back of his neck rose. "She's not here by accident," he muttered. From the shed, as if yanked by an invisible rope, came a thin, bursting answer. "Lucky." The foal's voice tumbled headlong over itself, too raw to be strong, too desperate to be anything but true. Ethan turned, already moving Rachel and Miguel at his shoulder. Inside the shed, Lucky spun tight circles, sliding on straw. He bumped the gate, backed up, and bumped it again, eyes wide and shining. His whole body quivered, hooves drumming a quick, uneven tattoo that shook the bucket in the corner. He pumped out a stream of frantic staccato calls. Miguel's swallowed voice gone hoarse with a kind of awe. It's her. His mother. There was no mistaking it. The sound that had shimmered across the pasture found its mirror in Lucky's throat, the cadence, the urgency, the aching pull in every note. Sound recognizing sound across distance. Blood calling blood. Rachel stood very still, as though any sudden motion might shatter something delicate and holy. She watched the mare beyond the fence, watched the foal trying to climb the gate with sheer want. Then she spoke, measured low. "This is extraordinary." Her eyes cut to Ethan, then back to the fence. "She's been tracking him. This reunion could be scientifically groundbreaking." "You're saying she's been searching all this time?" Ethan asked. "Yes," Rachel said without looking away. "Few mares show this persistence. We need to document every step." The words barely registered for Ethan beyond the surge of truth they carried. The mare's call came again, raw, unwavering. Lucky answered until his voice broke into a breathy rasp. Ethan felt the drum of his pulse in his wrists. There was no keeping them apart now, not without doing violence to something older and larger than any rulebook. Rachel shifted into action, quick and commanding. "We need the large paddock," she said. "Closer to the barn where we can control the space. Clear it of obstacles. We'll bring Lucky out there, then open the lane so the mare can come in on the far side. Everyone else stays behind the rail. No one interferes unless there's danger." Miguel was already shouting to 2 ranch hands across the yard. They jogged over, and within minutes, a practiced choreography unfolded, dragging barrels and tarps out of the paddock, checking latches, securing a secondary rail to create a wide, clean oval of space. Rachel moved through it all, like a conductor assigning positions, reminding everyone that sudden movement and noise could spark panic. "Call them," she told Miguel, and he nodded grimly, thumbing through his contacts. 10 minutes later, the rattle of tires announced the sheriff's truck. Sam Carter climbed out, tipping his hat, his face etched with skeptical concern. A second vehicle rolled in behind BLM's gray SUV with a gold seal on the door, and a few minutes after that, a local reporter's crossover nosed in behind the shed, a camera and a hopeful face peering from the passenger seat. The air thickened. The event had become something else, part science, part law, part spectacle. Ethan pushed the noise away. The only world that mattered had narrowed to the paddock and the fence line beyond. "Bring him," Rachel said. Ethan unlatched the shed gate. Lucky barged forward, all quivering legs and intent, then checked himself to press his forehead against Ethan's chest, as if making sure the world would hold if he moved. Ethan stroked the sleek line of his jaw. "Easy," he murmured. "I've got you." They walked together toward the paddock. With each step, Lucky's voice rang out a liquid, urgent sound, answered by the mare's long, unwavering call. Rachel, flanked by Miguel, opened the paddock gate. The photographers, the sheriff, the BLM rep all fell quiet, drawn into a circle of hush that is the prelude to holy things. Ethan led Lucky inside. The foal surged at the lead rope but didn't bolt. Even now he took his cues from the man at his side. They crossed the short stretch to the center of the arena. Then Ethan slipped the rope from around Lucky's neck and stepped back. On the other side, the mare Sierra, Ethan named her in his heart without knowing why, paced the fence sides, heaving. Rachel signaled with a small nod. Miguel swung the outer gate. Sierra came through at a long, ground-eating trot, ears locked on the small shape, standing at the center like a star blazing in daylight. Dust rose in a halo around her knees. Everything inside Ethan climbed to his throat. He heard himself whisper, "Go on, boy. She's waiting." Lucky trotted forward, then stalled at the threshold of a moment more immense than he could hold. He turned his head, and those wide, dark eyes locked with Ethan's. In them, Ethan saw the question so clearly he could have spoken it aloud. "Is it truly safe?" "It's okay," Ethan said, voice gone thick. "Go." The world tightened into one line, the line between them. Lucky stepped across it. Sierra slowed to a walk 3 strides away. The paddock fell so quiet Ethan could hear the wind comb the dry grass beyond the fence. The foal stopped, head up, ears pricked so hard they quivered. The mare lowered her head, neck arched, nostrils flaring. A small, tremulous wicker shivered loose from her throat, question-answer, litany, lullaby. Lucky edged forward half step, then another. Sierra extended her muzzle, drawing in the scent of him. The space between them vanished like a breath on glass. They touched noses. A sound went through the watching humans, something not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, something that released and gathered all at once. Sierra's eyes softened. She nickered rapid and quiet, and then she began to groom him the way mares do, to soothe, to bond, to say mine. Her lips traced the base of his mane down along his poll and crest, the movements rhythmic and sure. Lucky trembled, then pressed into her, tipping his face toward her chest as though to climb inside the safety he'd been missing. Rachel's whisper floated along the rail, scarcely breath. This is unprecedented. Miguel stood frozen hands, white-knuckled on the fence post. The sheriff blinked hard, jaw shifting as though chewing a memory he didn't want the camera to catch. The reporter lowered her lens for a heartbeat, eyes glistening, and then raised it again, as if she knew she was witnessing a story bigger than her paper. Sierra circled Lucky in slow, protective arcs, slicing a line between him and the world. He followed, stumbling once, then getting his feet under him, as if the knowledge of how to move had returned with the scent of her hide. The paddock held their voices, the low, vibrating reassurance of a mother, the small, bubbling answers of a child. It was conversation, make no mistake, older than any human language. Ethan stood 3 paces back from the rail hands locked tight on the top board. His memory rose like floodwater nights, with the bottle, the weak, stubborn pulse under his palm, the dark hours when he'd counted breaths between lamplight and dawn. All of it flowed into the sight before him, the foal he'd lifted from the edge of the world, now standing under the mantle of belonging. He couldn't stop the tears. They slipped hot and unhidden down his sun-browned face. He wiped at them with the back of his hand, and when he found his voice, it was a thread pulled from deep inside. "You made it home, Lucky." The foal flicked an ear at the sound of his name, and then tucked himself tighter under his mother's jaw. Home. The word had wings. Sierra lengthened into a trot, and Lucky matched her legs awkward for only a few strides before the old instinct took hold, and he found the rhythm of her gait. They skimmed the rail together, 2 notes braided into one line of music. The crowd breathed with them. Ethan stepped back once, twice, as though to give the moment its distance, as though to acknowledge that nature at last had taken back what had always been hers. The paddock sang with hooves and breath, with the tough, tender music of reunion. And for a long span, no one spoke. The land itself seemed to lean in, listening. The spell broke when a gray SUV rolled across the yard and parked beside the sheriff's truck. Doors opened. The woman who stepped out wore her hair bound tight at the nape and a jacket with a BLM badge stitched above the breast pocket. Her gaze went to the paddock, lingered on the mare and foal, then cut to Ethan with a cool, professional weight. "Mr. Walker," she said as she approached. "Karen Holt, Bureau of Land Management." Her voice held the smooth, implacable tone of someone used to setting terms. She took in the scene, Sierra circling Lucky at her hip, and then faced him squarely. "This is unauthorized custody of a wild horse." The words were clean and hard as a gavel strike. Ethan felt his spine stiffen. The crowd along the rail shifted. Even the reporter's pen paused. Dr. Rachel Morgan stepped forward, eyes alight, not with defiance, but with conviction. "Ms. Holt," she said, her voice crisp, "this reunion is unprecedented. We must learn from it." Karen's expression didn't change. "Regulations exist for a reason, and science exists to make those regulations smarter," Rachel returned. She gestured toward the paddock. "You are seeing a post-separation mother-foal reunion that most literature treats as improbable to impossible." She tracked him across unknown distances, likely over weeks. He's imprinted enough to accept human care, but retained wild behavior sufficient for reintegration. If we treat this as a standard seizure, we lose a rare chance to document what successful reunification looks like and to improve policy. Ethan found himself stepping in before he thought better. "I didn't keep him for myself," he said, voice steady. "I kept him alive." Sheriff Carter positioned himself between Rachel and Karen, palms slightly open, the eternal referee. "Karen," he said, tone low. "You can see it yourself." The mare came back. "The foal belongs with her." Karen's eyes flicked from Sam to Ethan to the horses. If her stance softened, it was by degrees too fine for most to see. "Intentions don't change the law," she said. Rachel didn't blink, but results can change the future. The air tightened. The paddock hummed with the continued quiet motion of mare and foal, a living counter-argument to the weight of statute. Karen folded her arms, considering. "Private custody of wild equines cannot continue." "That is not negotiable." "I hear you," Rachel said. "What I propose is not custody. It's collaboration." She pulled a small case from her bag and flipped it open to reveal 2 GPS collars of the lightweight kind used for short-term wildlife studies. "We fit both animals with trackers. We release them to open range now, while their bond is fresh, while the foal has momentum. We build a formal study around their movements, their health markers, their social reintegration. We submit weekly updates to BLM with full access to the data." She glanced at Ethan. "Mr. Walker no longer houses the foal. He complies with reporting. We abide by your oversight." Karen's silence stretched. She stepped to the rail and watched Sierra slow to a walk, drop her head to bump Lucky's shoulder with her muzzle, as if scolding him gently for weaving too close to the fence. She watched the foal answer with a flick of ear and a soft sound that, even from here, carried the simplicity of trust. Finally, she said, "I need to make a call." She moved away, phone already at her ear, speaking in a voice too low to catch. The reporter hovered, then thought better, and turned her lens back to the horses. The sheriff exhaled a breath he'd been holding for the better part of a day. Ethan stayed where he was, feet rooted like fence posts, every sense straining toward the paddock and toward the woman on the phone who might hold the hinge of everything he had tried to build and save. Rachel stood beside him, quiet. "No matter how this goes," she said softly, "you did right by him." He nodded without looking at her. "Right's a strange word today." Karen returned, tucking her phone away like a weapon holstered. She faced Rachel first. "Provisionally approved," she said. "Short-term collars. Immediate release. Weekly reports to our office, full data access. If the animals approach human dwellings or show signs of distress, we intervene. If your study deviates, we terminate." Rachel's shoulders eased a fraction. "Agreed." Karen turned to Ethan. "Mr. Walker, you will not house or handle the foal again. If you encounter them, you notify us." "Understood." He wanted to say he understood nothing of a world where saving a life invited punishment, but he kept his voice even. "Understood." The collars went on quickly and carefully. Rachel's hands, sure the small units, settling at the base of each neck, like strange temporary jewelry. Sierra blew softly through her nostrils, standing quiet beneath Rachel's touch, in a way that felt as much like consent as any human could hope to ask for. Lucky fidgeted, then stilled when Ethan stepped backward just far enough to avoid breaking the agreement hands at his sides and heart thrashing in his chest. The last latch clicked. The paddock gate swung wide to open country. The corridor of fence lines funneled toward the low break in the hills that was the ranch's northern boundary. A hush fell that was not silence so much as a tension honed to a fine point. Sierra turned her head. The open land called. She took one step, then two. Lucky started with her, then veered as if slung on a line straight toward Ethan. He stopped a stride away. The foal's breath feathered against Ethan's shirt. Then Lucky pressed his head into Ethan's shoulder, not hard, but with that earnest-seeking weight that had undone him the first time. Everything Ethan had held back all day surged forward. He set his hand on the colt's neck, fingers trembling despite himself. "You found your way home, son," he whispered, not trusting any louder voice. "Be free." The foal stood a heartbeat longer, as if the meaning of those words had to sink past hide and muscle and bone. Then he blew a small, satisfied breath and wheeled back to Sierra, tucking himself once more beneath the curve of her body. The mare lifted into a canter, and Lucky followed, stumbling only once before the rhythm of flight took him. They slipped through the open gate, a pair of notes resolving a chord, and into the amber wash of late afternoon. Ethan watched until the two shapes became brushstrokes against the far hills, then embers, then nothing at all. The moment they disappeared, something unclenched in his chest and released through his eyes, hot and clean. It felt like morning and victory braided together. No one spoke. Even Karen bowed her head a fraction, as if acknowledging that the law had taken a knee to something older for a single necessary minute. Days ran forward like water over flat stone. The study began, Rachel coordinating data drafting protocols, calibrating the collars to ping regular positions to both her lab and the BLM office. Karen's emails arrived each Monday, procedural, but not unkind. Sheriff Carter stopped by now and then, taking his coffee black and his updates in steady, quiet doses, as though faith could be rationed like sugar in a lean year. 6 months later, the first full report landed in Ethan's mailbox, a thick envelope with Rachel's tidy handwriting on the outside. He carried it into the kitchen, set it on the table beside his father's journal, and slid it open with the pocket knife Claire had given him on their 10th anniversary. Inside were maps and graphs, printouts and notes. He spread them carefully across the wood. A thin colored line traced Sierra and Lucky's journey over the Colorado Plateau, north and west, then east again, like a slowly loosening knot. Dots marked water sources, bedding sites, grazing grounds. Small annotations recorded herd encounters, met ban near Cedar Wash, temporary association, no conflict. Observed in company of bay stallion with star possible integration. Foal now yearling in good condition, gait strong, foraging independently, remains close to dam. He imagined them there, Sierra sturdy again, and the hardship melted from her ribs into power. Lucky stretched into a yearling with long legs and a neck washing into the broader lines of a colt. He imagined the thunder of their hooves, in proper company, the dust rising behind a dozen bodies, moving as one. The liquid communication that passed through them like current. At the bottom of the summary page, Rachel had added a handwritten note. "Ethan, the data supports what you believed in. Your bones intervention, then release, can work. He's thriving. You gave him that chance. RM." Ethan let out a breath that might have been a laugh if it weren't edged with something else, emptiness maybe, or the release of a tension he had carried too long to name. "You did it, boy," he said aloud to the empty kitchen, and then shook his head, the hint of a smile catching at his mouth. Life at Red Mesa Ranch settled back into what it had always been, fences needing mending, cattle to doctor seasons to endure and welcome in turn. Dusty still flicked his ears at the same wind, still found the surest footing on the ridge trail without being asked. In the evenings, Ethan would sit on the porch with the journal open on his knee, adding small notes that were sometimes about rainfall and sometimes about memory. On the cabin wall above the desk, he hung one photograph of the one Rachel had sent, taken by the reporter on the day of the reunion. In it, Sierra's muzzle touched Lucky's forehead, while the foal stood with eyes closed, draped in the kind of peace that has weight. For Ethan, the picture was more than a keepsake. It was a map back to himself. When he wrote, he found his entries drifting as often to the laws that governed his work as to the other laws, the older unwritten ones that had carried him through. He had bent the first, and he would be paying small prices for that in paperwork and carefulness for years. But the second those laws of mercy and kinship held him as surely as the fences held cattle. You could argue with statutes. You couldn't argue with a mother calling her young across a valley and being answered. One late afternoon, as autumn returned and the light slanted just so across the red earth, Ethan took Dusty up to the low knoll where the ranch spread out like a rumpled quilt below. The wind smelled of sage and distant rain. He turned in the saddle and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the air press cool and clean against his face. From far off so far, he might have imagined it came a single brief whinny, a bright thread that the wind laid carefully across the distance. It might have been any horse from any band speaking any of 1,000 small truths. But Ethan chose the truth that settled easiest into his chest, that Lucky and Sierra still ran somewhere under that sky woven into the broad fabric of the land. He opened his eyes and smiled small and sure. Love once spent freely had not left him empty. It had made a path beyond the fences and the pages of the law out into a world wide enough to hold both grief and grace. He touched Dusty's neck. "Let's go home," he said. The geldings stepped out sure-footed as ever, and together they made their way down the hill, the light thinning to gold, the shadows lengthening like memories behind them. The desert, eternal and unsentimental, received them both, and somewhere in that clean, open vastness, the echo of a young horse's call was still running promise enough for any man.